It was a foggy night in 19th century London. Richard Rick Hawthorne and Samuel Sam Blake moved like shadows through the city's oldest cemetery. Their coats were dark and long. Both men were skilled in their work, and the shovels they carried hinted at something sinister. The pair was notorious among the underground medical networks, supplying corpses to doctors and surgeons desperate for research material. When they reached the middle of the cemetery, Richard stopped, adjusted his gloves and looked around. His gaze landed on a grave, blanketed with fresh flowers, a clear sign of a recent burial. Kneeling down, he brushed aside a stray petal and focused on reading the name carved into the cold stone. The name on the headstone read, Margaret Howell. Richard signaled for Sam to start. Lowering the bag he'd carried, Sam picked up a shovel and began to dig, soon joined by Richard. The only sounds piercing the still night were the clang of their shovels against the earth and their heavy breaths. Richard's face remained calm and focused, but Sam's features betrayed a troubled conscience. As he worked, his eyes seemed distant, weighed down by an inner struggle. Richard noticed and tried to ask what was bothering him, but Sam merely muttered that his conscience was beginning to trouble him. Eventually, their shovels struck wood. Richard signaled for Sam to stop and gently cleared the remaining dirt from the coffin. When it was fully exposed, Richard lifted the lid and carefully removed Margaret's body. Just then the moon slipped out from behind the clouds, casting a pale glow over her face. Sam shuddered at the sight. Moving quickly, they placed her in the large bag they'd brought, then covered the grave to look as if it had never been touched. Sam hoisted the bag onto his shoulder. He followed Richard out of the cemetery, and a short walk later they arrived at a large, secluded house on the edge of town. Richard knocked lightly, and a moment later an older man opened it, Dr. Jonathan Hanks. Known for his grim medical practices, the doctor supervised the theft of corpses, which he then sold to hospitals and medical schools for dissection and experimentation. To Dr. Hanks, this wasn't a crime, but a necessary act. He justified it by claiming that experimenting on the dead helped advance medicine without endangering the living. He ushered them in, eyes gleaming with excitement, as he gestured for them to place the bag on a large table. Eagerly, he pulled a small pouch of coins from his coat and handed it to Richard, who glanced inside, pleased to find it held more than he'd expected. Richard pocketed the reward with satisfaction, while Sam stood back, his face clouded with unease. Then, as the doctor eagerly opened the bag, he froze. His face twisted from curiosity to horror. As the body inside stirred, Margaret's eyes opened, and she drew a long, shuddering breath. "What kind of trick is this?" Dr. Hanks said, glaring at Richard. Suddenly, a loud banging sounded at the door, making everyone jump. Dr. Hanks turned, eyes wide with panic, while Rick looked tensed. Sam seemed relieved, as he had been expecting this. "Hands up!" the officer barked. Dr. Hanks and Richard exchanged a glance of resignation, knowing resistance was pointless, and slowly raised their hands. One officer approached Margaret, who was breathing heavily but otherwise unharmed, and offered her a glass of water. The specially designed coffin had allowed her to stay hidden for hours, though she'd been near her limit. But she'd held on, knowing her moment was coming. Dr. Hanks stared in shock. "A setup?" The lead officer smirked. "Not a setup, a sting. Officer Margaret here planned it all, and Sam helped make it happen." Richard turned to Sam, his eyes searching for answers. "Why, Sam? You've been with us for so long. Why now?" Sam looked down, his face a mask of shame. But before he could answer, the officer spoke. "We offered Sam a new life and a clean record in exchange for helping us bring down this operation," Sam said. "They offered me a way out, a chance to be free," his voice barely above a whisper, thick with shame and regret. Is this story amazing to you? The most shocking truth is that it's not only a fiction story, it's based on real events that occurred in the United Kingdom during the 18th and 19th centuries. Body snatchers were very much a part of this grim chapter in history. They were commonly known as resurrectionists. These criminals were hired by anatomists to steal the recently deceased from their graves and supply bodies for medical research. Between 1506 and 1752, very few bodies were available for dissection. The Murder Act of 1752 allowed the dissection of executed criminals, increasing the supply of bodies for research. However, it still wasn't enough to meet the growing demand from hospitals and medical schools. As a result, body snatchers began stealing corpses, operating in a legal grey area. To protect graves, measures like night watches, mort safes, and heavy stone slabs were used. The public strongly opposed body snatching, and riots often broke out, particularly at execution sites. Things worsened after the Burke and Hare murders in 1828, where people were killed specifically for their bodies. In response, Parliament passed laws allowing the bodies of paupers to be used for dissection. In 1831, the discovery of the London Burkers, a gang of body snatchers, led Parliament to debate a bill by Henry Warburton. The Anatomy Act of 1832 allowed anatomists access to corpses from workhouses, reducing the need for illegally obtained bodies and effectively ending the resurrectionist trade. If you enjoyed this dark chapter of history, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more shocking stories from the past.